Welcome to Alienating the Audience, where we go deep into science fiction, beyond the space battles and cool aliens, to ask, what does this actually mean? What's the point of this? And today, we're going to explore one of the all-time greats, Robert Heinlein, the patron saint of the competent man, rugged individualism, and free love. It's like Burning Man on the freaking moon. It's a great chat with Andrew Mayne, and afterwards, my friend Nick Sperduti and I talk about our recent exploits performing comedy on Quonos, the Klingon homeworld. All right, grab your gun and put on your helmet. We're going to go kill us some space bugs. My guest today is Mr. Andrew Mayne. He is a writer and creator. He just had a special on Shark Week on Discovery, which is amazing, and has a new book coming out, probably out by the time that this podcast releases. What's the name of your new book?
The book is called Dark Pattern. It's the fourth book in my Naturalist series featuring computational biologist Theo Cray.
Nice. And so we have the pleasure of discussing science fiction with you, and you are a science fiction writer, speculative fiction writer. How do you want to bill yourself?
I certainly got my start in doing like science fiction techno thriller, and I would say that my books get categorized as that because there's a lot of science and speculative stuff in there, but I generally, I advertise myself as a thriller writer because I make more money doing that.
Yeah, that makes sense. I like the people I know that write thrillers do make more money than the people I know that write about rockets. So maybe I should rebill myself as rather than a comedian, I'll say I'm a thriller joker or something.
There you go.
That sounds like a sex
that
thing.
worked really well this weekend. So
yeah, it's true. You're right. So, out of curiosity, how big of an impact did Heinlein have on you as a writer?
First, as a human being, as a kid growing up, is you discover sort of the science fiction greats, and I think that a lot of them spoke to ideas. And Heinlein was the first one that really spoke to philosophy for me and morality and other things in a way that I thought was more thoughtful than some of my other favorite authors. And when I decided to write, if you read, let's say, my Theo Cray books, the Naturalist series, it features a scientist character who is involved in unusual things, who explain things to the audience. And I think that was one of Heinlein's strengths, was his ability. So many people got into physics, got into astronomy, got into that because there were kids, they're reading this stuff, and you could come away with a good understanding of orbital mechanics and planetary motion, etc. So big influence.
But he's an interesting guy. He's a hard sci-fi writer, and one of the first early, because now he's influenced science fiction so much that it's difficult to really separate him from the field. But when he was writing, I mean, he's starting in, I guess, the 30s or 40s, and coined the term speculative fiction because at the time science fiction was all just pulp. And sci-fi did not have any type of factual or hard basis to it. And he and I think probably Asimov and Arthur C. Clarke, kind of the big three, all come in and really add a lot of their actual engineering background to it. And I find him interesting in that I don't like super hard sci-fi. For example, I've never been able to work my way through Red Mars, which seems to me to be the travails of several very quiet engineers on Mars. I never get past that because it's so heavy on the engineering. Whereas with Heinlein, big on engineering. Apparently, like, he and his wife spent 2 days one time figuring out an equation that's just one sentence in The Cat Who Could Walk Through Walls. Like, literally, they're doing all the background on this. But I don't feel like it reads like a manual in any capacity. He appears to have been fairly influenced by Kipling in terms of indirect exposition, which is to say, rather than just spelling out, in this universe, these are these planets and this is how this happens, he just constantly references things as if you already knew about them in a way that moves the plot forward very quickly and really flushes it out. So he'll, like, my favorite book by Heinlein is Friday. And there are these little references where it just references like a super dog. And it says the super dog could have this fairly limited conversation about how much he hates cats. And you can just infer from that, okay, that the world we're in now must have these genetically engineered creatures, and we've got sort of upgraded dogs. Maybe there's cats. And he doesn't give you a paragraph explaining what happened. He just lets you draw the inference from it. And it for me, being a non-technical person and not an engineer by any stretch, I can follow all of that. So I think he's a really interesting way to straddle, good narration at the same time having actual firm knowledge of how science works.
Yeah, you can certainly see the differences between books. I think in some of the earlier stuff and some of the juvenile books would get a little more explanatory because he was looking at who his audience was, or they wanted to get a concept across. And I would say some of the later books, also because. And I don't remember like the Super Dogs, or if he's the one that had Simps, or if that was Arthur C. Clarke, the Simple Chimps or whatever like this. But sometimes they would appear in another story that he had, and later on he'd bring up that concept again, and rather than explain it again, just sort of just leave it there as is as a thing. And I like that. That's one reason I love Frank Herbert is that Frank Herbert has this universe that's 10,000 years in the future with its own past and all these things. And you read about chair dogs and you realize it's a living chair. I don't think it's enough attention. It's just the way we think. We're very good at sort of dealing with multiple realities at one point. Like this could be true, or this could be true, this could be true. I'm going to follow a story, watch a movie, and any one of these things could be true. And then at the end, it's like a collapsing wave function. You're like, oh, I get it. This was the through of all the way through. And sometimes you just have enough of an abstract idea to keep going, and it doesn't matter later on, rather than some technical stuff you pointed out get so details, and it's just engineer porn.
Yeah, all of it I enjoy, but I do like the kind of mythology that accompanies a lot of the things. Like I don't like Stranger in a Strange Land that much. It's not my favorite by any stretch. I think it's kind of overbilled. However, the sort of taxonomy of Mars comes into play several times. There's different books. I think the juvenile books reference the Martians a couple of times, and they're sort of these. I think he calls them nymphs. They're these tiny rolling balls in the Martian desert, and then they turn into these three-legged creatures, which actually, fun side note, the author or the writer who wrote the script for The Trouble with Tribbles in the original Star Trek series wrote the script and then thought about it.
David Gerald.
And then he went, oh no, I think I plagiarized Robert Heinlein, because he thought I must have
Flat Cats.
Yeah, I borrowed the Flat Cats reference and turned it into a Tribble. And I don't know if I think NBC at the time, whoever owned the rights to Star Trek, actually reached out to Heinlein to buy the rights to the book in order to do it. And Heinlein went, just send me a signed copy of the script. It's fine. So he was a mensch and possibly behind Tribbles.
Gerald, I've met Gerald, attributes, Flat Cats, credits to Heinlein for giving him permission to use that. And Heinlein was, from everybody I've ever spoken to who knew him, he was an extremely generous guy. I listened to Jerry, Purnell and David Niven speak about Larry Niven. David, that was another book, but yeah, Larry Niven and Purnell talk about Footfall and some of their breakthrough books that they did, and that was one of their biggest sellers ever, and how much they said they gave it to the Heinlein to look at, and he came back with copious notes and edits and things, and they give him a lot of credit for shaping the book into good shape, and he didn't want any credit. He just was like, no, here, guys, just go with it. And he was, the reason he's got such I think a lot of high regard is so much of what he did behind the scenes. We know about his books, but other authors knew they could go to him, and he was a wonderful resource for that.
And apparently is the one who popularized the phrase "pay it forward." He didn't coin the phrase "pay it forward," but according to the research I've done, that basically entered the English lexicon as a regularly used phrase through Robert Heinlein. I can't remember which story it was, but he basically kicked that off, and appears to be part of his philosophy.
He's got grok and that. So
grok, which is a wonderful term, and I'm going to misappropriate the word grok, but for my purposes, when I use it in communication, it seems to me that there's a very helpful distinction between understanding something in abstract versus understanding something and emotionally resonating with it. And although that's not how he would define it, I think he defines it as becoming one with the thing or something to that effect. I use it in that way. I think most people use it that way of, I don't just hear you, I get it, I understand what you're saying, or I can't quite grok that, or I can grok that. It's a wonderful term.
Yeah, I think about it when somebody tells you a thing or a tool or an idea or something, and then you find yourself using it, and it's you incorporate it into yourself, and I think that you get it, and then it's kind of part of the context of it, and it's kind of, I like it. It's a little more well defined than like the gestalt, of something.
Yeah. But easier to say. You don't have to know any German. You just have to know a little bit of Martian.
And I'll say this about Strange Language. I don't know how much it would hold up if I read it now, but I certainly know as a teenager reading this, it was a very, it was, I came from, I'm, a rugged individualist sort of, mentality and sort of that background. And reading that and seeing that you could still be that and have this emotional side, you could be accepting towards people who are completely different, and what your identity is not impacted by somebody else's identity.
Yeah.
And that was a big, I think that was helpful for me, was to say, like, I can feel this way about how I should behave in the world and what my moral compass is. Somebody else can have a different one. And as long as it doesn't come face to face with me, then that's fine. As long as they don't interfere with my rights, I don't have to step on their rights, et cetera. So that's, I think, one of the things I took away from that.
Well, and you've touched on a couple of the themes that I think you see throughout the corpus of Robert Heinlein. One is definitely rugged individualism, and I like that you point out that the book has both the sort of tender, receptive side and the emotional, and the rugged individualism. It's a cuddly Ron Swanson that oftentimes appears in his books. It's Ron Swanson in an orgy. It's this kind of free love, hyper libertarian character that shows up in a lot of the stuff. And I think that's one of the things that he's constantly working out in his books. He seems to be fascinated by what is the role of society and conformity, and you see that in The Moon is a Harsh Mistress. You see that in Stranger in a Strange Land. There's the idea of rugged individualism and self-reliance. Censorship tends to be a big thing in his work, and you see that definitely in Stranger in a Strange Land. And the other thing, which is, I don't even know if I'd call this a theme so much as just a trope, is there's a lot of sex and a lot of free love. And Stranger in a Strange Land, I think he, rather than just having it be a fun plot device for him, he actually does explore it and get into it, because since he's been dead for a few years, we're going to go ahead and do spoilers on this. If you're unfamiliar with the work of Robert Heinlein, it's your own fault, and Andrew is free to spoil me because I haven't read Tunnel in the Sky and a couple other things. Yeah, and Stranger in a Strange Land. The really interesting part of that to me was that the main, or Valentine, the main character, is living in this free love environment, and he's getting into the sexual mores of it, which would have been even more intense when it came out. I think, did it come out in like 82? I can't remember. No, Friday came out in 82. I don't remember when Stranger in a Strange Land came out.
Stranger in a Strange Land was like 1963 or something like that. It was early 60s.
Yeah. It's at a good mind-blowing time in American history for squares and things like, nobody's using the phrase polyamory in 1963 in common household parlance.
I'm gonna just pull that up just so I don't save our listeners the trouble of telling us, hey, you guys are wrong.
Screwed up. Is an interesting thing to Stranger in a Strange Land. Again, it harkens back to Kipling a little
1961.
bit. 1961.
Sorry.
61.
Wow, even earlier than I thought.
Okay.
Yeah.
So basically the 50s. The one interpretation of that, and I don't know whether Heinlein backed it up or not, but one interpretation of it is that that's basically Heinlein retelling the Jungle Book, except rather than Mowgli being, raised by animals and entering India, Mowgli is raised by Martians and entering Indiana. And so there's that kind of fish out of water coming to terms with the system phenomenon going on throughout the book.
Yeah, I've read both, and I don't know. I've never really sort of done analysis. I've
seen the Disney musical, and it's point by point exactly the same. All the songs are the same. Yeah, all the same animals. Yeah, I've never read the book. I don't, or not the Jungle Book anyway.
No, yeah, I've read that. I mean, I love Kipling, so I'd be wondering, because, and there is, sometimes too, and sometimes we remember the book that. Obviously we remember the book that got the most attention at the time, or we talk about the thing that had the most, the thing that everybody talked about, but we forget often the things that came before, and an example of this is like, you look at, go into another topic, like one of my favorite books of all time is War of the Worlds, right? H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds. And War of the Worlds is an amazing book. It set this template that we use from now on when you want to do alien invasions. If you're going to go see an alien invasion movie, chances are it's going to follow the template of War of the Worlds, where, first there's a signal, then there's the beachhead, and then they start to do this, and these things happen. And it gets repeated over and over again, the same formula as War of the Worlds. I always thought that was kind of curious. And then I went back and did research on War of the Worlds and the origins of that. And War of the Worlds came out at a time when one of the most popular novels in Britain was actually novels describing what if Germany decided to invade. And that was the template Wells was following, was the idea of taking a contemporary story of Germany decided to invade England in the 1880s, 1860s, 70s, whatever. What would that have been like? And if you go read War of the Worlds like that now, and you understand why the naval battle is such a big deal and these other issues there, and you understand that like the Martians land, they don't do anything. Well, it's like the Germans make a beachhead and they build a camp and they're waiting and we're trying to figure out what's going to do and that. And so whenever I think about like people say, oh, this is like this book, I'm like, it may be, but it may be like an entire genre of that, because you had Edgar Rice Burroughs, who did sort of the stories of the people in the wild coming to civilization, then back into the wild, etc. So
yeah, entirely possible. Yeah, I will say that it is a great emblem of Heinlein on free love, which happens. I got to say, it happens comedically at this point when I read his books. Like, so the last Heinlein book I read recently was Farnsworth's Freehold. And Farnsworth Freehold, not as well known as some of his other works. For those unfamiliar with it, it begins with the nuclear apocalypse happening in America, and there's sort of a time travel incident that happens. But I'm reading the book, and I'm going, oh, this is great. I mean, it's all of the characters are very bully and very plucky. They're very Heinleinian in that they're all 100% optimistic, can-do attitude. Like everybody's having a good time playing bridge as the universe is collapsing around them. And I'm reading this going, okay, well, it's still very upbeat and Heinlein-esque, but it's a lot more adult and serious than the other books I've read. I mean, it's dealing with nuclear warfare and the end of civilization, and there hasn't been any sex. And literally, as I'm thinking that, there's been no sex. The mom of there's like 4 people in the bunker, 5 people in the bunker. The mom takes a Quaalude and goes to sleep. The kid goes to sleep, but her 22-year-old daughter friend stays up, and the dad, who's also awake, is like, oh man, all this radiation sure is making me hot. I guess we should take our clothes off. And then they're off to the races. Like 18 pages in, dad's having sex with the 22-year-old daughter's friend, and I was like, yep, that's Heinlein. There's always that. But he explores that a lot in his work. He was apparently in real life, at least in his, I don't know if his third marriage, in his second marriage, he did practice an open marriage. He didn't want to. He didn't want to necessarily have obligations. And I think most of the lady characters in his books at some point say something to the effect of, oh, I'm madly in love with you. Let's get married right now. We don't need a church or the state. We'll just have an obligation to each other. But it won't include any type of sexual obligation. You can do whatever you want. I totally understand that you'll want to go get some strange. And they always have this like ferocious sexual appetite with zero obligations associated with it.
Yeah, you certainly you read enough in there and you pick up things like the bridge plane, and then the sex is sort of like, all right, I think I know a lot about him now and who he was. And it's interesting too, because like that early days of science fiction was the science fiction writers, whatnot, was really, sci-fi is a collection of oddballs now, but even then, you think back in the 30s and the 40s and stuff, and the first conventions, the first groups of people there, who was gravitating towards that, and and then you sort of see, when you have your contemporaries are people like Heinlein and then L. Ron Hubbard, who were friends even well after L. Ron Hubbard created Scientology, and accordingly, what I've heard from friends of Heinlein was that Heinlein was the only people that Hubbard could just talk one-on-one, be square up about like, hey, it's all BS, it's a hoax, whatever kind of thing, because he'd created such a thing around him, and he would lament to Heinlein, like, what have I made,
Really?
Because,
so that makes me like
have a cult.
L. Ron Hubbard a lot more. If he like behind the scenes, he's like, oh, this is all bullshit. It's just for taxes and getting laid. Oh man, this is really getting bigger than I intended. We got a boat now. I got to do boat maintenance. Ugh.
Oh yeah, I mean, it's like. The problem with the cult is you end up surrounded by cult members.
Oh yeah, that's the downside.
So that's when you start a cult. That's your day to day is But I used to joke like, yeah, I mean, you start a cult and then you spend the last days of your lives with teenage girls in mini skirts lighting your cigarettes. Is that any way to live? Well, but then he died in a trailer, so it was really kind of sad. Yeah. Maybe possibly murdered. We don't know, but.
Yeah,
but the idea that he was,
he'll make for a good episode as well, L. Ron Hubbard. And I've read a bunch of his short. There's a really good short story collection named for him. The L. Ron Hubbard like award series or something. Like they did a good job of getting people. I don't think I've actually read any of his books, but I should. Although not the Dianetics one. I'm not that interested in that. I just want to see if he was good.
It's always a competent thing because you bring him up and then there's always the whole and then he started this this very very scary cult with all of that. that stuff and the human mistreatments, et cetera, and all those allegations. But let's get over that. And I feel awkward saying this because it's like, the books are held by them and whatnot. And I know people who've escaped from there, left there, whatever, and had a tremendous amount of, and so out of respect for all those people, but still, I'm going to say, like, they did a wonderful job of taking those short stories and doing audio dramas of those. And if you ever want to listen to really well-produced audio dramas, they took like the works of L. Ron Hubbard, they've made them in these audio, they brought in professional actors and did really exciting, fun. I mean, they're pure pulp fiction kind of stuff, sci-fi pulp from 30s, 40s, whatever. But, there's stuff like, battles on the moon because the moon's become this big, the big station at which you want to launch missiles from, and the Americans trying to fight the Russians and stuff. And just with sound effects and actors and drama, I'm like, I had a lot of fun listening to those. They're the most well-produced audio dramas I ever heard.
And apparently he was still chummy with Robert Heinlein, so there must have been something that was good there that Heinlein was able to. And Heinlein was good friends with Asimov as well. And in fact, he Asimov, who worked at the Philadelphia Naval Base during World War II, got brought in specifically by Heinlein. I don't know if there was already a science fiction connection or not, but they worked together for the U.S. military during World War II, and then remained friends for a significant time after that. Like some of the political inferences that I've read about of Robert Heinlein come specifically from Asimov analyzing Heinlein, who says that he was very, very liberal and then married Guinea and then became a right winger from Asimov's perspective. So, but anyway, they were friends, and we're bumping around the same circles.
Yeah, I've heard that, and it's. But again, it's also you hear somebody say we became a right winger, and it's like, well, we became a libertarian,
right? Yeah, and I'll hold back because we'll get into the politics in a minute, because I think that is fairly central to Robert Heinlein, and I agree with you. I wouldn't call him a right winger, but Asimov might have. But before we jump into that, I do want to talk just about some more of the themes that you see present in his work. We talked about free love for a minute, which I don't think can be understated, and I'll throw out. I really like Friday. Friday, same thing. There's it's a good old free-for-all, just a big old naked free-for-all all the time. The other thing that really strikes me about Heinlein's work, it's both in terms of his archetypes, but it's also thematic, is he loves competency. I would say Heinlein is like the patron saint of the competent man. And he's got, there's a good passage, I think it's either Jubal Harsha or Lazarus maybe, that talks about how every man should be able to, make his own bricks, and I can't remember everything, but it's like 40 different things. But all of Heinlein's characters are always just super plucky, can-do guys that like wake up and time to build a spaceship, and they're just completely undeterred. And he like a lot of the plot, like I don't know whether it would qualify as a juvenile novel or not, but I read Spaceman Jones recently, and Spaceman Jones is this plucky, can-do farmer kid, self-educated kid from the Midwest that basically
Starman Jones.
Thank you, Starman Jones. Fakes an identity, gets onto a spaceship, and super competent. And the all of the travails that he have comes mostly from just petty people trying to put him down out of sheer pettiness, and that's kind of the nemesis in a lot of his books is pettiness. And the quality which redeems people is competency, which I enjoy. It makes for a fun read.
Yeah, it's funny. I remember reading, and it may have been, I don't know, Starman or one of those, but like, he had his father was like, talk about his father only made a certain amount of money, but his father, like, if I need this, I go make this. I need this money, I go make this, or something. There was a reference to character. I'm like, well, Heinlein never got comparative advantage, but that's a separate point. He absolutely loves that idea of being able to, and I think as a kid, you read this and it's neat because you sort of, it makes you want to learn how to have skills and be able to do things. And, I think that's sort of, the kind of the core idea of, rugged individualism is, hey, be able to stand on your own 2 feet. Now, really, in a complicated society, you need to work with other people, but be a plus, not a minus.
Well, and that's where I'll take a little bit of an economic stance against Heinlein, and the aforementioned Lazarus quote that I can't recall from memory, but every man should be able to change a tire, direct a battleship, navigate a star destroyer, like all these different things. I'm like, I'm not even making that much money, but it's not really worth my time to change my own oil. It costs like $15 to do it. I've got better things to do with my time. So I would argue that he perhaps eschewed specialization a bit too much. But part of that was because because he loved this idea of the competent man, which brings me to archetypes, because I love Heinleinian archetypes, and I have identified 4. Tell me if you want to tweak any of these or add any of them. I think every Heinlein story has 4 archetypes that are constantly oscillating. There's the competent guy that we just talked about, always very bully, just can-do attitude, smart dude, problem solver, completely undeterred by the situation. There's the sage. So there's usually an old guy with a very wry wit who at some point in the book gets laid. That usually pops in. Yeah. So like the essential version of that is in Stranger in a Strange Land. Jubal Harshaw, who's this very quippy old guy in the Moon is a Harsh Mistress. There's La Paz. There's usually this sage character. There's the other. So in Stranger in a Strange Land, it's Valentine, who's this kind of quasi-Martian character, and the Moon is a Harsh Mistress. It's the robot or the computer, and then there's the walking vagina. He's got these. I enjoy the women in his books, and I should do a follow-up episode with a lady to talk to a lady about her interpretation of Heinlein, because I find that his female characters they're very smart, they're very individualistic. They're very strong-willed, but they're also hypersexual, and they're always just wanting to jump in the sack with no obligations, and they're very kind of male fantasy characters in that regard, where there's a lot of sexual gratification built into his female characters.
Yeah, and it is certainly, growing up as a teenager reading those, and as a male, you come away from one point of view on that, and you probably don't. I don't think I noticed as much as that they see. The women sort of showed up to sort of often serve that the trophy purpose, or not fully trophy, but they were more dinner. But certainly that was, I would probably feel differently as a woman reading and go, well, why is it always this? But I did, what attracted me though was he described really intelligent women, really creative and competent women, and that's been sort of thing I've always liked is you want your equal or your better. You want somebody that challenges you, and I love that idea that the women were presented as just as smart as the guys, or seemed to appear to be so. And of course, in his defense, when like Lazarus Long gets a sex change, he becomes a hypersexualized woman. So
yeah, well, yeah, and that is a good point. So again, my favorite book by Heinlein is Friday, and I think the reason I enjoy it so much is that the character is both the competent man, the competent person, and the femme fatale, nymphomaniac, who's or if not nymphomaniac, just very sexually libertine character who's also very competent, very intelligent at the same time. And I I dig the whole free love thing. I like the agenda he's pushing. I don't think we need to put up as many hurdles as we put up. So I like that the world that he wishes to live in is one in which sexual mores are lessened and orgasms are exaggerated. And so I kind of I'm for that. Yay Heinlein on that regard. Let's bring some Burning Man culture to the rest of the world.
Yeah, and I was looking up because it was. Did you happen to see the movie Predestination based on All You Zombies?
That's not the one where a character ends up becoming his own mother, is it?
Yeah.
I did see that one. Yeah. So that's the snake who eats his own tail. That one.
Well, that was Predestination was based on the short story All You Zombies.
Okay. Yeah.
But he's done another one. He had like a Lazarus Longo back in time. He's done that before, but I loved that because that was a really good I'm going to take a character you like, and you're going to introduce it, and you're going to identify, and then now all of a sudden we're going to have a female character. You're going to realize that the fluidity there or whatever. And I thought that for a guy who's this harsh right winger, I'm like, man, he did a lot to talk about ideas of identity, gender, and whatnot. And I think that in ways that are just so unrealized. I think that people don't.
No, I think you're right, and I think we'll dissect the right winger thing in a minute, and I think we both reject that moniker for him. But I think what you could say is that he is one very libertine. He's very much libertine and very much a hedonist in his outlook. So his viewpoint appears to be if you enjoy doing something and it's not hurting anybody, then you should do it, and not just. You should have the legal right, but no one should be judging you, and you should not care if anyone judges them. So very libertine and very iconoclastic. I think he's clearly fascinated with social obligations and social relationships, and for that reason, he got into a little bit of trouble because he had some story. I can't remember what it was, where there's a pair of twins, a sister and a brother, and the way he explains it is that their genome is. Perfectly juxtaposed in such a way that they could not inbreed. And he's basically like, so I guess they can have sex, and they do. And people were like, oh my God, he's supporting inbreeding. And no, I think that's Heinlein doing basically a thought experiment of like, hey, why do these taboos exist? What's the purpose of them? In what circumstance would it be okay? And you hear these in philosophy discussions. Is it okay for a brother and a sister to have sex if they're post menopause? And like it makes you feel creepy, and then you have to investigate, why does that make me feel creepy? And is it a societal thing? Is it a genetic thing? Is there a reason for it? And he was constantly pushing boundaries in that regard.
Yeah, I think that's a question, is that sometimes people confuse somebody positing a thought experiment for advocacy, and I think that's and today that gets lost even more, because you can specifically say it's a thought experiment, like, oh, you're advocating, like, no, maybe the opposite or whatever. But like, because I remember as a kid, like reading a book and like, he would have, a character describing when he was younger trying homosexuality, and then it didn't take or whatever. And then there's, some straight character. And, growing up as this, a straight kid who didn't at that time know anybody who was gay or whatever. And it was just this sort of concept. It was taboo sort of thing, like, oh, they're gay or whatever. And you read Heinlein, just mentioning like, oh, yeah, no, this person, that, but whatever, but they know what they are. And you're like, oh, yeah, I guess that doesn't bother me, that and so that's one of the things like, again, we can get into the whole, the labeling of that, but that's one of the things I'm like, I learned more about understanding other people's perceptions and the way other people want to choose to live their lives through Heinlein than to anybody else.
Yeah. Well, he's definitely very tolerant in that regard. And he, he seemed to have I believe he was an agnostic and a self-proclaimed agnostic and owned the label. I don't really get the impression that he was anti-religion, but he didn't seem to have a problem making fun of it. So like another book that I quite like is Job, is it Job, a Divine Comedy? I can't remember.
Comedy of Justice.
Thank you. Job, a Comedy of Justice, which is a really fun book. I really enjoy it. And it's fun in part because he clearly has no restraint in terms of the mythology he can build up. So it's not like it doesn't read like anti-Christian propaganda, and I read it, and I don't think I was religious at the time, but I don't remember having any like feeling that he was targeting, Baptists or anything. But at the same time, because he's not in any way constrained by a Christian worldview, the universe in which he writes there's kind of multiple gods with there's a god for every different version of Earth in the multiverse, and there's like the Norse universe where there's Odin runs that planet, and then there's our planet has a farmer god from Judea, but he's like a farmer. He's kind of this American Gothic character. And then there's like a demiurge above all of them. And because he's kind of making fun of religion and he doesn't have to actually maintain the bounds of these storylines, he can play around with it in a really fun way.
My favorite thing about that book was he goes into like the Satan worship world, and they have high-tech cars, everything's super advanced, and I'm like, and there was incest and stuff too, but I'm just like, what is he saying here,
Yeah, it gets really like, the main character goes to heaven and is a saint, but it's like, I can't remember, like it's kind of overcrowded, like there's problems with it. Like it's like, it is much more geographic than spiritual. But that said though, he doesn't carry any, let's say, traditionalism or sort of consensus moralism. Those are not elements.
And one of the points of like in Stranger in a Strange Land, like you go back there and you like the antagonists were, I think partially was like organized religious people, whatever, who had a problem with Michael Valentine Smith and the movement. I think when
the moral majority or something presaging it. Yeah, they're nemesis in it.
Yeah. Yeah, and so I think that's a thing that it kind of comes back to the kind of individualist idea of like do what you do, but when you try to organize people or tell other people this is this or that, whatever, that he has a problem with that.
Yeah.
I mean, he probably shaped my entire life the more I think about it.
Yeah, I came into him later. I grew up reading Asimov when I was like in middle school. I tried to read Heinlein when I was in high school. I tried to read Stranger in a Strange Land, and it didn't take the first read, probably because I was incredibly religious when I was in high school, and it might have just been too much for me at the time. I remember specifically finding Jubal to be very preachy and not liking that. Now it's not my favorite book, but it doesn't rub me the wrong way. But yeah, I find it fascinating. He plays around with the concept of marriage quite a lot. So like in Friday, you have marriage companies where so like Friday the femme fatale competent sex pod character is like she owns like stock in a family, and you basically come. It's like a law firm where you come in as a partner, and like when they divorce, they have to have settlements and that kind of thing. And that is very, very libertarian. Probably the only because I know a lot of libertarians. I would say myself, I see no reason for the state to be involved in marriage. I would just assume it all be marriage just contractual. In that case, it's actually like 3 or 4 people. So it's like a polyamorous marriage. There are multiple wives and husbands in that equation. And I think it's the same way in Moon is a Harsh Mistress. I don't know if he explains the legal mechanisms of it, but they are kind of polyamorous family units that are up on the moon.
Yeah, contracts come up a lot, which. And it's also, it's like, man, this is a writer who's dealt with multiple divorces and estate planning.
Yeah. Well, because real quick, just to do a quick biopic on him, my theory, by the way, before I researched him, just given the sheer amount of sex in his work, this is what I thought. I thought Robert Heinlein probably married a woman when he was 19 and then stayed married to her for 80 years and then was just constantly using literature as a way to get into sex. Turns out he did get married early on. I think he got married when he was like 22, but they were only married for a year. I don't know anything beyond that. It was a very quick marriage. He got married, I think, right before World War II for about 15 years, during which time it was an open marriage. But that marriage fell apart because his wife became a progressively chaotic and destructive alcoholic. So that one stopped. And then he married a woman named Jenny. And stayed married to her for the rest of his life. I don't know whether that was an open marriage or not, but there's some speculation that a lot of his female characters were based off of her because she was this very vivacious, intelligent, I think, chemist and rocket tester. So she was this sort of walking science fiction character that he married and had that. But yeah, he's always playing around with the idea of marriage and that kind of thing.
Yeah, I don't, because you've heard people like, oh, well, he went to the right when after he married her in Virginia. And I'm like, how do we know it wasn't, he was already going that way and he found a partner that matched his thing? And that's the thing, because it's in one of the things that, I try to emphasize is that when you read somebody describing what happened, whether it's their own event or whatever, it isn't, and it's just people like, this is very basic and literal, Andrew. I'm like, it's an account, and people take it for this is the thing that happened. And my girlfriend's been reading a George Lucas biography, was written about him. And I said, after you read this, I'll tell you the other one to read, because most everything in that book came from interviews with Lucas over years telling you this. There's very little of the book from, let's say, somebody talking to Brian De Palma in 1979, asking him details about this or whatever. And so what becomes fact is just there was a big body of work from one source that later on we all go, well, that's the source. So, Asimov at sci-fi conventions telling you his version of things or whatever becomes, well, everybody knows this. Well, it's one, and I love Asimov. Let me make that very clear. But you just sort of get that.
Right. You're getting the one perspective. Well, and the other thing too,
from a lot of voices, but it goes back to the one source.
Yeah. And the other thing that we should add too is that it is, a kind of fallacy to assume that someone's opinions remain monolithic and homogenous for the entirety of their life. I don't know very many people like that. There are a few, but I'd say most thinking people have some form of nuance or evolution over the course of their life. And so it would be odd if Heinlein had been on a one-way trajectory of one political idea, particularly for somebody who thought as clearly and hardly as he did and liked to probe ambiguity and kind of break things apart. It would have been weird if he just stayed one thing the entirety of his life. So I agree with you. Pinning his I think maybe Asimov being a socialist in good standing, or at least a social democrat in good standing, I could see him being irritated by Heinlein's Republican wife. But at the same time, though, I don't know. Heinlein seems to have such strong libertarian philosophy in there that I doubt it. Just he married a woman and converted to she gave him a copy of Ayn Rand, and that was it. I suspect there was a lot of internal stuff going on.
What I love about Asimov too is that you read his stories and you get into you're in New York City, whichever the fifth incarnation of it, 3,000 years from now, people living inside and they don't see the sky, and they're inside of this dome within the dome, and things don't work. And I'm like, I'm like, Isaac, maybe you should step back and look at your idealized form of this is a horrible system. Like, do you see the problem with the way you want to organize things here? And
he was also like Asimov was very much a technocrat, right? I mean, like a literal technocrat, because Asimov
planning technocrat,
yeah, because he would like to like technocrats today just want to find a cute person in a sweater vest from an Ivy League institution and give them lots of power and go, well, as long as we have smart people in charge, things will work well, and give smart people lots of power. Yeah. And Asimov was like, I want to go a step beyond that and give a robot power. And as long as it's a robot and we can get rid of the problem of what is it? Politics without romance. That concept. As long as we can get rid of the intent. So Asimov very much that kind of machine. Whereas Heinlein, conversely, like one of the themes in his work is freedom is found at the frontiers. So he's constantly in his stories going to the edge of space because he sees the existing state structure and the existing civilizational model is stultifying, whereas the edges are where the free thinkers and the libertines are going.
I want to pull up the date when it comes, because the one of my favorite examples of this is you look at the early versus later Heinlein, and you take the Roads Must Roll, okay, 1940 science fiction story by Heinlein about the moving sidewalks and stuff. And he started off from the point of view like Asimov, like this big central planning technocratic, this is the way things work. And then over time, you didn't get stories about big, massive planning or projects or systems and stuff, because I think there's pre-World War II, and then that, and then after the fact, and then as he starts to realize that, maybe there's other ways to get things done, or sometimes these big public works projects, maybe aren't the only solution.
Yeah, he would appear to be skeptical of that, although he does start in that camp. He was a proponent of Upton Sinclair's, I can't remember the exact program, but Upton Sinclair, so famous, if not socialist progressive in American history. I think he wrote The Jungle. And I believe the phrase, it's difficult to teach a man something that his livelihood depends on not understanding. I think that's an Upton Sinclair quote. Very clever guy, if nothing else. But he was running for governor of California as either a socialist or a progressive, like a very progressive candidate, and had a program called California to End All Poverty or something to that effect, but very much liberal policies, progressive policies. And Heinlein was one of his supporters and was working in that camp. And then appears to have a trajectory shift somewhere around World War II, because he writes in part he writes in part Starship Troopers as a response to anti-war activism, because I'll say today, libertarians do not tend to be muscular foreign policy people. Libertarians tend to be very much intervention skeptics. They like Tulsi Gabbards of the world. They want to just trade with everybody and have sex with them, but don't deploy troops anywhere unless absolutely necessary. Whereas Heinlein appears to have been pretty muscular in that regard. He kind of parallels Goldwater, who I think he supported and maybe volunteered for at some point. Barry Goldwater, Republican candidate in '64, is both very libertarian in terms of his domestic policy, but also very much a muscular foreign policy, anti-communist, let's go invade other countries guy, as is Heinlein. He's one of the few science fiction writers of the era that wrote a paper in defense of the Vietnam War. So most of the other sci-fi writers are not in that, but he was pro that. And when protesters were trying to get Eisenhower to stop nuclear testing, that's when Heinlein's like, no, it's either capitulate to the Soviets or we have our own nuclear bombs.
Yeah, he had and I think that he had this. If you pay attention like we have, you realize he's a much more complicated guy. But I was thinking, just the pro-war paper he wrote, which, again, if you subscribe to, the dominoes theory and all that back then, there's a point to that. But the point is, I think that a lot of people's perceptions of it come from the outside, and sometimes somebody does one thing, then all of a sudden, Bob Hope, the example, this guy is the most important guys to comedy ever. Every comedian goes on stage is doing a version of Bob Hope's act. This is the guy that made a transition from dance halls to vaudeville to theater, Broadway, all these things. Yet, he was, a Nixon supporter, and in, Vietnam, he put him on the other side of counterculture, and all of a sudden you had for decades comedians like, oh, Bob Hope, he's a has-been or whatever. And, one of the things that kind of, I want to say hurt me, but sort of affected me was I was a freshman in high school when Robert Heinlein passed away, and I'm sitting in class, and I had a teacher who was one of the social studies teacher who taught a grade ahead of me, and he walked through the classroom, and I said to him, I said, Robert Heinlein died, and the teacher turned to me and said, good, he was a fascist, and then kept
wow.
And I know he was trying to be quippy or this or whatever. And one of my friends is still
strong words from a sophomore high school teacher.
Yeah, he was one of these guys that found that teaching was an alternative to serving, which, you know, I don't blame him. But it was one of these things where it was just this. And it was like that guy thought he understood Heinlein. And I'm thinking my Heinlein was, hey, no, I read this book that helped me understand, like, you know, to get out of sort of this, you know, a right-wing moral point of view, or, you know, sort of a Christian sort of moral point of view, and be a much more, you know, open sort of mindset towards other people and stuff like this, and not be judgmental. And all. My view of Heinlein was, you know, he made me, you know, I considered myself, you know, at that point, I'd say a classical liberal, you know, and in the idea of that's what introduced these ideas to me. I went from being just a straight, I think I'm just a conservative, to maybe I'm classically liberal, and let me embrace some ideas of progressivism that I think have value. Mm-hmm. And this guy just shot this down, and I'm like, you don't understand. Like you're thinking Starship Troopers and maybe some commentary on Vietnam written by former World War II veteran who had a very different point of view on these things. And you just, in one moment, you know, it was just sort of a weird experience.
No, I agree that. Well, and I'll add to that while I certainly don't know that social studies teacher, I think there are a fair amount of people that use the term fascist to describe a person they don't like or disagree with. So like getting into play, I find it's actually quite difficult for people to pin down what do you mean by fascist? And they usually, like, what they ultimately mean, at least in the current milieu, is they mean a conservative they're afraid of. But let's take actual fascism is.
Let's start with Mussolini.
Mussolini, who incidentally Mussolini claimed simultaneously that he was a fascist and a socialist. He saw no problem between the two, because at the time there were international socialists like Trotsky who wanted to have a class-based socialist revolution as opposed to a state-based socialist revolution. And you had national socialists like Hitler and Mussolini who wanted to have a nation-based socialist country. So Mussolini didn't see himself. He started as a socialist, and then in addition to that, he became a fascist. Fascism, the hallmarks of it are a strong authoritarian state, usually with ethno-nationalist tendencies, but it is in a totalitarian framework. Heinlein, conversely, was basically an anarchist, a free love anarchist. And so, like, the moon is a harsh mistress. I don't think they have a government on the moon. I think it's all, there might be, but if they are, he doesn't really get into it.
It's like a company town, but
it's like a mass movement. Like there's a great example of the moon is a harsh mistress is, their judges are just some guy. Like, you get into a dispute with someone and you just go, you know what? We all agree Bob has a pretty square head on his shoulders. Do you want to just, okay, we're both going to give Bob $25. And if Bob agrees to judge, we're just going to accept whatever decision he has. And that's it. Like, it's an ad hoc Judge Judy environment where you just, there are no actual judges. So that is not a fascist way of running a nation. That is, in fact, about as far away as you can get from a fascist doctrine. I can kind of see it if you're looking at Starship Troopers in a vacuum.
Sure.
I can understand why that would happen, because one of the really interesting thought experiments in Starship Troopers is that you can't vote unless you're a veteran. The only people, he calls it the franchise, and you only are capable of being involved in the political process if you served in the armed forces. And the logic that's extolled in the book is this displays that you're willing to subsume your own personal interests for that of the group. So it's sort of like you earn it. And okay, I see that having a collectivist mindset to it and an authoritarian mindset to it. But I also, I don't know how much Heinlein believed that versus how much of that was just him thinking out loud in a book. And
it came out from a period when just every able-bodied male was enrolling, and so the idea of that, when the military is at such a large size that then if you think about when you get to it's like, if you say that book's feel fascist, it's like I love the movie Starship Troopers because it's like it doesn't have to deviate far from the book to now make points about how scary, these movements can be, how scary nationalism can be, and how scary, the state having too much power can be, as I see it.
Yeah. Well, and like we should say, I agree with your earlier assessment. I would not put Heinlein as a conservative or as a right winger. I would say he was very much libertarian, through and through. All of the stuff I've read of his, he seems to have a very, very intense appreciation for the individual and individual autonomy, and a really skeptical attitude towards authority, deference, power, and just sort of any type of censorship or societal come down. And it's a very libertarian way of thinking.
And a phrase that I've always liked since I first heard it was the idea of the little L versus the big L, because people often hear libertarian and they immediately assume the political party versus the philosophy or that, and that's a thing that and obviously maybe for your listeners we don't need to separate that from, but that's sort of I think often distinctions important to be made. Libertarian, the classical liberal sort of sense.
Sure. Yeah. Well, and I like getting into the mindset. So on a different program I do, on the political program I do, I had a guy named Arnold Klingon, not Arnold Klingon as in Arnold the Klingon, but I had a man on named Arnold Kling, and one of the things he's done in his own academic body is separates sort of the heuristic models that you're going to function in terms of interpreting data if you're a progressive, a conservative, or a libertarian. So if you're a progressive, the heuristic model that tends to be there when you're watching a news story is there's an oppressor and a victim. That's the that's the framework that I'm going to interpret data through, is who's the oppressor, who are they taking advantage of. Conservatives tend to see it more as civilization versus barbarians, or civilization versus entropy. But it's the tagline is there's a threat to civilizations. Civilization is under attack, right? And so that's going to influence how they view, say, like border issues and things like that. Whereas libertarians, it tends to be a dichotomy of voluntary versus coercion. And in that regard, the mindset is very much a classical liberal one, which Robert Heinlein is going into. It's things are voluntary. A lot of the units of cooperation are like the family contracts and things. They're not state institutions. They're not laws. They're just people kind of getting together. And a lot of the time they're operating outside of the bounds of a state, or if there is a state, it's a very, very minimal one. So he I think very squarely falls into that little L libertarian camp. I agree. Yeah. So then we've covered some of the big books. We've got Moon is a Harsh Mistress, which I think is the libertarian apotheosis of both his work and maybe of libertarian fiction. There is, I was unaware of this group, but there's a group called the Libertarian Futurist Society that gives out the Prometheus Awards. And I think Heinlein is, like taking the cake and probably kicked off the entire series. There is, I do want to come back to Starship Troopers real quick. Do you what's your takeaway from that? Do you think that was a warning against fascism, or do you? I mean,
no, I don't think it was a warning. The book itself, I don't think it was a warning against fascism. I think it was, it's a war, it's a military, an early military sci-fi book that I think is one of the early best military sci-fi. And I think that, I don't think at the time that it was written that I'd love to pull up the date on that. Just so I'm not speaking, but I don't. I think that's a good point of view, though, is to later on and look at it and say, hey, this is how a very intelligent person, at that point in time, we have this habit of going back and judging, where people were. So let me pull out the.
No, I think you're right, because if I'm not mistaken, I think he actually said that he viewed that as an anti-communist work, because he was sort of comparing, the nemesis in that book are the bugs. Although there is another great example of indirect exposition where he mentions the skinnies a couple of times. We don't really know who they are. There's some civilization that we're sometimes allied with, sometimes fighting, but we're fighting the bugs. And he wanted to have a kind of hive mind Myrmidon character is a stand-in for communism, which he thought was completely juxtaposed to the human experience, because humans operate as individuals, and if you're trying to compel them to operate as a hive, it won't work, and so we're fighting that. And so it probably was from
1959. That's
so pretty solid Cold War material right there.
Yeah,
taking a swing at the commies.
And also the commies of that era was, just a few years prior when he started working on it, was, we had the end of the Korean War, which was, the Chinese communists, which was in its own, threat in its own way,
And I should point out, just from a literary perspective, that's kind of the birth of the Space Marine archetype. Kind of like Battlestar Galactica, for example, which is all Space Marines. It's these very gritty soldiers in space. That starts out with Robert Heinlein writing Starship Troopers. Prior to that, there's a whole lot of kind of Zap Gordon adventurers and explorers and things in space, but there's not really this intense military thing. I'll also say when I read that, I have zero military training. The closest, I'm an Eagle Scout, and that's still several football fields away from a military background. But I read that book and I was like, oh, I kind of get how corporals work now. The character works his way through the ranks, and by the end of it, you're like, I understood how ranks worked in the Navy because I grew up watching Star Trek. So I understand the relationship between lieutenants and captains and things like that, but I was kind of mystified by all of the corporals and colonels and things. But he works his way up through the book, and then the culmination of it is, I think, his father, who is highly skeptical of becoming a military man. We're business people, we don't get into military and politics. And at the end, his dad goes, you know what? Actually, I'll join the military, and his dad ends up working for him. So there is this full circle of yes, we've decided to fight the good fight, and we're all competent military men now.
Yeah, I learned too, a lot of things you learn from there. You can learn about naval structure through reading Heinlein because of his experiences there, and then when you read the other military stuff, and I, like you said, I think I don't know of before that other military sci-fi that was detailed and like that and influenced a lot. You watch the movie Aliens, and you realize, wow, Bug Hunt, all this sort of stuff, and you're like, This is James Cameron, clearly a fan.
Yeah. Well, I would imagine a ton of people owe a debt to him. Let me think. A couple other things we can talk about before we kick off. Another theme that he does deal with in his books that I'm only latently becoming aware of is race. He does tackle that a few times. One of the things I actually quite enjoy about Heinlein that I'm confident he did intentionally is that he'll write a book and about a third of the way through, he'll go by the way, that character's black. And he's doing it like the 60s when this is much more racially charged than it is today. And there are avowed bigots running around in the 60s that, are in favor of segregation and that kind of thing. And so he'll write characters that are in places of authority or high status positions. And then he'll let you develop a sense of familiarity and companionship with them. And then he'll drop what their race was, which is a really nice kind of magician's trick that he did. And then he also, I haven't read all of the books that do with race, but in Farnsworth's Freehold, there is this kind of weird inverted thing where, at the beginning of it, they're in the bunker and dad's shacking up with the daughter's friend, but then the bomb sort of pole vaults them into the future by 20,000 years where society is run by a kind of weird oligarchy, but it's a black oligarchy, and the sort of the races have been reversed, and it's I think it's rather than him making a statement about black people are good or bad or white people are good or bad. I don't think it's anything like that. It's more of what happens when you reverse the roles with people. What does power look like? And the takeaway from it, I think, is that just power is bad, and that racism is bad because one of the characters in it once in a position of authority becomes a villainous character, whereas he's in favor of escaping and living on the frontier with the 22-year-old, which is the goal of many Heinlein books.
Yeah. I liked that too because I think one of I like the approach of let me pull you into a character, let me see you think, give you a theory of mind and how they see the world, perceive the world, and now I'm going to tell you some other factor about them, and then you're so invested in them because you see too, and I see well-meaning people and I'm sure I'm guilty of this I'm sure I'm guilty of this too, but you see very well-meaning people. They introduce race at the top, and then they fall right into archetypes, the sassy character or this or whatever. And if you say, well, let me put that aside, let me detail the person from the inside out, and then finally when you get to the outside, they're a much more developed person. And so I like the fact that he did that.
And I can see that from Heinlein too. I would think Heinlein, because his characters tend to be, one, I think he relies on those rotating archetypes of the competent person, the femme fatale, and all of that stuff. The actual racial component does not seem to be a big factor for him. Nor would it. It would be fairly incidental. You could have in Heinlein's universe, you could have you would just have a starship full of very competent white and black people, but they're all competent, and that would be the predominant characteristic of them. Cool. Well, hey, Andrew, thank you for joining me on this chat. I will in the future. I'll be doing episodes on specific books and works from Robert Heinlein, but I wanted to do a just kind of broad overview of Heinlein and getting into his corpus. Before we go, for anybody that somehow has sat through the length of the program without reading a Heinlein Heinlein novel, which seems unlikely, but in the event that there are some people, what would you recommend starting people out on?
Oh, geez. I mean, if you want just a fun read, Starship Troopers is a fun read. It's a fun. I mean, I just it's a neat, fun. Let's go kill a bunch of alien bugs. Where there's a lot more kind of going on there. I think that's I think that's one of mine. And I think other ones you can kind of before you get to, let's say, Number of the Beast, you want to read a bunch of other Heinlein stories. That's one of my favorite ones too. But you want to read a bunch of other Heinlein because that sort of is a connecting sort of thing between them all. So
nice.
I'd say Starship Troopers is a good starting point.
And if listeners have fallen in love with you, Andrew, where can they go to look at your works and read your own stuff?
AndrewMaine.com, MAYNE, AndrewMaine.com, and just type in Andrew Maine at Amazon.com, and you can find all my books.
Wonderful. Thanks, Andrew.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Hey, listeners. Thank you so much for reviewing Alienating the Audience on iTunes or your favorite podcast platform. It really does help, and I appreciate it. Prospective listeners look at those reviews and they go, oh, there are a bunch of these reviews on here. Maybe this isn't just some guy in his parents' basement. Whereas in reality, of course, I work very hard at this, and I record these out of a former nudist colony in Texas, which is now a YouTubing studio, so completely different. So thanks, lads, gals, and androids. And if you've been enjoying the show and you haven't yet reviewed it, kindly do me a solid because it really does help. Also, I can psychically hear several of you screaming right now about omissions from the Heinlein canon or interpretations which I bungled. Feedback is always welcome. But honestly, I think you'd have more fun going on our Discord channel, Heaton's Heathens, where you can banter with other nerds about the episode, Robert Heinlein, or science fiction in general. And I'll put that link in the episode description. My friend Nick Sperduti and I are comedy buddies from New York. We're on the same improv team, and we pal around the galaxy sometimes. I have the odd stand-up gig. Sometimes he's got something going on. Sometimes we combine forces. We did that this last weekend. We did Second City Quonos. So Second City, as you probably know, very famous, very prestigious improv and sketch group out of Toronto. Actually out of Chicago. I think they started in Chicago, and then they're in Toronto.
Chicago.
And they've got it's not as big in LA. And then they've got now a fourth branch on Quonos, which is the Klingon homeworld, and that's where Nick and I were doing it. We had a 30-minute sketch show that we did, a 2-man sketch show. It was a lot of fun. And Nick, I got to say, I loved Quonos. I thought it was a blast. I enjoyed the people. I had a good time. I will say that the Klingon audience, they get rowdy. Klingons get rowdy, but you know what? They're there to have fun. And I enjoyed that. I just found the whole thing infectious. I thought that the mood was great. A lot of bottles thrown, a lot of threats of violence. But then again, like I've done some seedy clubs in the past, but everybody had a fun time, including me.
Yeah, it was fine.
Did you? All right, so you're just kind of a neutral on Quonos?
Well, honestly, I wasn't expecting it. I knew what it was about, and I did do my research, as I always do.
Yeah.
I didn't think it was going to be quite so. I don't know what the word the word I'm looking for is like gross. He was kind of like the food was.
Yeah. Okay.
Well,
yeah, that's.
The food was disgusting.
You know what I think the problem was in your case, because you did on the flight over, you read that Wikipedia article on Klingon, and so you were learning all these things about I'm trying to sleep, and you're like, hey Heaton, did you know that the Emperor Kalis he united not one but 4 continents? And I'm like, I don't even really
4,
care.
yeah.
But you seem to really go down the Klingon history rabbit hole, which is cool and everything. But you didn't read any of the you should know type stuff. Like you should know, don't make direct eye contact if you're holding a knife because they will stab you, and just things like that, right? Kind of the street smart stuff.
Well, I brought that knife as like a gift. I brought that knife as a gift. Okay, I didn't know that I couldn't just look at someone that I was going to give the knife to.
Yeah, okay.
I didn't expect to be pummeled.
Right. Yeah. It worked both ways because that guy did try to kill you, but later when you handed it hilt first to the head of I think it was House Duras or whatever, and you were like, hey, this is the finest blade that has ever been made on Earth. It's called a Swiss Army knife. he really liked it. Like, I think he put it down on his boot and everything. And then when you showed him the little corkscrew and he was like, oh, this is for a man's heart. And you were like, yeah, sure, whatever. Like, he totally got a kick out of that. Like, we should start doing that from now on. I don't know if Swiss Army knives are the way to do it because of the TSA, and I don't want to have to check my bags and stuff. But maybe getting, like, I don't know, like a bottle of wine from Earth or something and just giving it to our hosts. That could be a good idea.
That's not a bad idea. I mean, again, I didn't have a bad time. Right. It was a lot of unexpected stuff.
Yeah.
I got attacked at least 3 times more than I thought I was going to.
You got attacked a lot. Like, it was kind of funny. I gotta be honest with you, because it was like if you could imagine a Laurel and Hardy routine, except that Hardy is just constantly being assaulted. Like, imagine like both of us are pretty thin, right? But I'm gonna be Laurel for this purpose. So I'm walking down the street, I got my bowler hat on and everything. You're walking down the street and just constantly imagine like linebackers with swords trying to murder Hardy. That was most of our trip. I don't even know. Like, I think you put out a vibe that Klingons just don't like. I don't know whether they find me amusing or whether they, like I've earned their respect, but for whatever reason, no one really wanted to tangle with me. Everybody wanted to fight you.
You know what? And I don't know what it was. I don't know if it was my smell. I think that offended them somehow.
Could be.
I was told that apparently I didn't hold up the right number of 3 when I was supposed to. It was the wrong fingers. They hold it up with like the first 3, and I held it up the other way, and that got me in trouble.
Well, but
and then that other guy.
See, but the other thing, too, is like you got to understand Klingon etiquette, right? You buy rounds. Yeah. That's how it works on Kronos. So, that one Klingon came up and he went, I am Bark, son of Mortog. I will buy you rounds and celebrate honor. And I went, I am Heaton, son of Joe. He's an attorney. I will buy you a round. And, we all bought rounds and but you didn't want to buy a round.
I said, I'm Nick. Hello. It's nice to meet you. I'm from Earth. I do a lot of stuff. Some comedy, some acting. I'm married. You'd love her. She's really nice. And I said, my father, if we're talking about fathers now. And by then I was already attacked. I was already shoved over the bar.
Yeah.
And at that point I was going, his name is Howard. And they were just pummeling
they didn't care.
And throwing liquor bottles at me. And I don't know. Here's the thing. The only good thing about it is most of the time it was just tackling, not a lot of really solid hits.
Yeah,
just a lot of
that's
tackling
the weird thing.
for some reason.
It's kind of like I almost wonder if that's their version of hugging, because they definitely damage you, but it doesn't seem like they're trying to damage you. It seems like they just enjoy the thump. It's almost like they're going for the sound.
Yeah,
but you gotta. Well, the other thing too is like, all right, so when we sat down with Bark, and Bark is like, 3 horns of blood wine. And I was like, hell yeah, let's get us some. I'll have some blood wine with you there, Bark. And you were like, no, hey, thanks, Bark. No, I'm going to have a gin and tonic. And then when it came turn to buy your round, like, you were nice about it and you were like, hey, thanks for the round, but I didn't actually ask for I only want 1 drink, so I'm not going to buy everybody rounds because I want to be. And it's like, I get where you're coming from, Nick, but you just got to you got to just plug into the culture and buy rounds.
Well, I'm financially set in a certain way.
Yeah.
I have my own means that I have to work off of, which I think we can all agree with.
Sure.
And I'll tell you what, when I had to stand in front of the High Council and they were just kind of spitting out stuff at me, and the House of Lords, they were just shouting like, Nick, this is, I didn't understand half of it, but it was a lot of just like mean-spirited. It obviously came off very mean-spirited. I don't know what was being said, but rude. And then they were telling me, like, it was something along me not buying drinks, and then and it was a lot of stuff about my father, which I only mentioned to him really briefly. I don't know.
And by the way, I kind of regret my role in that, because I'm still not entirely sure why you got summoned in front of the Klingon High Council. I think maybe you accidentally killed somebody, but I'm not entirely sure. In any event, they asked me...
You think that guy in the cab? You said I didn't hit him hard.
Well, we had to get to the...
You kept saying you saw him get back up.
Right. Well, okay, the thing is, we had to get to Second City, right? The call time is 7:15. It's 6:45. We're doing... It's only 8 minutes away, but there could be traffic, and Kronos traffic is crazy. So I was like, you know what? I don't want... And probably there's not a lot of bureaucracy on Klingon, but you know how or on Quonos, you know how I feel about bureaucracy. I don't want to have to fill out a bunch of forms and stuff, and so I was just like, yeah, he's fine. I saw him get up. Yeah, but anyway,
wow.
The other thing I feel bad about is that the Klingons came to me and they went, Heaton, son of Joe, are you his attorney? And I went, yeah, I'm his attorney. And they went, all right, you've got 15 minutes to save him. And I was like, well, this is a kind of a golden opportunity for me to test out some new material on a Klingon audience before we go to Second City. So
you just kept going through jokes.
Yeah, I just kept going through. But they did well. You got to admit, the Klingon High Council really liked my stuff.
Here's the thing.
I had that Gowron joke. That killed. The Gowron joke was fantastic.
It did kill. It did kill. I'm not saying there was bad jokes, but I'm saying you weren't trying to save me whatsoever.
No.
Number one. And number two, just because your father was an attorney doesn't mean you are.
No, that's true. Well, actually, so technically Dad's a judge. And they said that on Klingon, on Quonos, you can inherit those judgeships. So, like, I think maybe actually I was like a visiting judge or something. Either way, you didn't get the death penalty. So it might be. And there at the end, I went up and I went and talked to the judge, and I was like, hey, man, be cool. And he was like, I am cool. And I was like, yeah, but seriously, though, be cool. And he let you off. So, anyway, my point is, it all worked out. Oh, except for the Targ.
Yeah.
Because I tried to adopt that Targ, and they wouldn't custom. You know what? And I want to be very clear on this. I'm not blaming the Klingons. I'm not blaming Quonos. I am blaming the TSA. They wouldn't let me bring the Targ onto the shuttle, and so that's just a shame. And I had to leave the Targ there. I did find somebody to take care of the Targ for me, but
they murdered the Targ.
What? No.
The minute you put it down, I saw it. As soon as you turned around, you were like, all right, I'll see you later. You had named it Gatsby, I think.
Yeah.
And they said as soon as you said bye Gatsby, it was like one. It was really sweet. It was kind of a sweet thing. And then you turned around and after the embrace, and you started walking towards the airport, and I was in tow, and I turned around to kind of wave, and then I was tackled again.
Yeah.
If you remember. Yeah. And then as I was on
the floor, they called it a goodbye tackle, and then they laughed really hard. And then you remember when the pilot came out to tackle you? I have never seen that before. I have never seen a pilot come out and tackle, and the stewardess, flight attendant.
Yes, I'm never going back. I'll say that.
You know what? I'm not going to do.
I'm never taking that airline again. But also, I was on the ground,
Klingon Air is not the best. I will give you that. And their gach, that is, you can tell that's been freeze dried.
You know what I'll say about that? Gach. Am I right? But
save it for Second City, buddy. don't give out the best jokes right now.
They did. I saw him stab that Targ in the head, but it was a sharp blade.
Okay,
which is weird because most of their blades look very dull.
Yeah, no, isn't that weird? Like, they seem more decorative than anything. This is my take. I feel like Klingons really, the Klingon culture is basically just 16-year-old boys. That's pretty much the whole planet is 16-year-old boys. Sure. I had a great time. I will say that, how do I put this delicately? Well, okay, so I mentioned this on the last podcast. Whenever I go to another planet, I like to scope out the local talent on Tinder. And so I went on Klingon Tinder, and I apparently I think by Earth standards, I'm probably like a 6.5. By Quonos standards, I am like an 8 for some reason. I don't know, which I don't even understand because I'm clearly not as muscular as those other guys. Hit it off with a nice young lady from House Martok, and we went and got some blood wine and did some karaoke, and then how do I put this? That was just a violent, consensual but very violent sexual encounter, and I broke my hip. So plus, did get laid, and had a nice romantic tryst on Quonos. Downside, wound up in the emergency room, and broke my hip and several bones, and I think 3 ribs, and she bit part of my ear off. So I don't know that I would do that again, just because it was a little bit beyond my comfort level. And
I'm in traction. So you can keep complaining, but I was tackled 9 times on this planet.
I gotta say, that was hilarious, because there I am in the emergency room, and the doctor's, he's healing up my rib cage, and then he just sees you, and then just immediately launches into you. Like, just
he just tackled me right in the hospital.
Like, you haven't even said anything. There wasn't a knife or anything. Just tackles you, and you get more severely injured than I did, and I at least got to have some sex. So, yeah.
I have a concussion, at least.
Certainly. Well, and the fact that, like, you know, I have to assume Klingon doctors have more technology than walk it off, but that's what they told you. You got up and they walk it off. It's like that might be the only English they know is walk it off. And in my case, though, they did set the leg and they did set the hip, which was nice of them. So that's good. And they were out of network with my health insurance company, but so I had to pay a little bit more, but it's fine. Next time I might get travel insurance. But yeah. Anyway, I had a great time. So okay, so you're
I'm glad you enjoyed it.
Yeah. No, it was a really fun trip. So it sounds like you're kind of neutral to not go again on this. If I like, you didn't hate it, didn't care for it a whole lot.
Maybe I need to prep more. I don't know. Maybe next time I'll wear armor. Maybe that's a thing that I should.
Could be, yeah. The pint thing we already talked about, and we could have.
I don't drink beer. What do you want me to say? I don't. I'm not going to do it for the Klingons.
Well, I mean,
I don't do it for me.
Okay, first of all, it wasn't beer, it was blood wine. So, I mean,
that's
do you drink
so
blood wine?
much worse.
Yeah, you know what? I will say this. Imagine Merlot. Now imagine Merlot with about half a pint of blood in it.
And I only drink Riesling.
An acquired taste.
So
yeah,
I only drink Riesling.
Like
if it was blood Riesling, I'd think about it.
I wouldn't surprise me if they do that, but it is definitely an acquired taste. If you don't like blood in your drink, you probably won't like blood wine. To be honest, like
blood in your food.
I think you got to kind of be there to really appreciate it, because I don't know that I would order blood wine like at my local pub. I think they've got it because they do a lot of craft beer and stuff, but I don't think I would order it out of my way. Same with Gach. I didn't really. I can eat Gach. I didn't super care for it. Klingon television's great. Really enjoy their sitcoms. They're pretty funny. I will say they still have laugh tracks, which is weird that the Klingons still have laugh tracks. But but if you like physical humor, it is just constant. Basically, it is. Who are those 3 guys that hurt each other a lot? Not the Musketeers.
The Three Stooges.
That's it. It's like the Three Stooges with knife fights. There's a lot of blood. It's pretty funny.
And also, every show is basically porn, which is why you liked it.
It was great, yeah. It was really, like, if anything, it was just porn with Three Stooges violence breaks. Like, imagine really aggressive pornography, again, consensual, but then every 5 minutes they're like, and a knife fight. And then they'd have, like, you know, they'd sell jewelry or something for the commercials, because they've got commercials just like we do. We're not that different.
Even the commercials were like porn, though. Half of them.
Yeah,
they were just broke into orgies in the middle of selling something.
Yep, there was a lot of that, and there was also a lot of commercials where a guy would, they would just film a guy like bursting into someone's house and challenging them to a fight unless they bought his vacuum cleaner, which I got like so much better than regular Earth commercials, in my opinion. Like, I don't know if you've seen a used car commercial recently, but they're just some smiley family that won't shut up. But like with the Klingons, though, like you're getting like there's some drama built into it. I would watch Klingon commercials for fun.
I'll be honest. I wish I'd have seen that commercial before the actual guy knocked on the door to sell us the vacuum.
That was amazing. He kicks the door in, and I'm like, oh my God, are you King Tao, son of Bill? Like this, I totally just saw you. And then he just slugged you with a vacuum cleaner, and you're lying there bleeding, and there's noticeably a tooth on the floor. And then he goes, buy my vacuum cleaner. And I was like, this is crazy. I just saw you, man.
I'll tell you what. I was tackled maybe, I don't know, 20 times.
No, you're lowballing it. Maybe the first day.
And I'll say maybe it was the smog of the city.
There's a lot of smog. They've got bad traffic.
So it was very smoggy, and it could have been that, but something else just kind of.
See, the smog thing though, granted, it's not good for you. I just looked at it as an opportunity to smoke cigars. I'm like, I'm already inhaling this crap. Might as well smoke a stogie. Hey, Klingons, you guys want stogies? And they're like, yes. And then I make friends with them again. It's awesome.
I think we should go back to Vulcan.
Okay, well, Agree to disagree. Well, Nick, it was a pleasure traveling with you as always. Thanks for coming on the podcast, talk about our latest exploits, and look forward to our next adventure.
See you next time.
Yep.
Yeah.
That's the show, a solid hour of Robert Heinlein fandom, topped off with some intergalactic vagabonding. Thanks, Andrew Main, for guesting and filling our noggins with Heinleinian goodness. Thanks, Taylor Standridge, for pulling all the gremlins out of the audio, which is, as I understand it, what audio engineers do. And thanks, Nick Sperduti, for yet another glorious adventure on an alien planet. We'll see you next week. Tally-ho!